So we'll get started. This is Comics and Politics. I'll be your host for this evening. My name is Joel Christian Gill. I am the chair of the MFA in Visual Narrative at Boston University. I'm also a cartoonist and historian. I've been drawing comics for almost 20 years now, and I've written 8 books. My most recent book, Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, that I co-wrote with, I adapted Dr. Ibram Kendi's 2016 National Book Award winning book. I want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming to this panel. It's the 4th annual Boston Comics in Color Festival. And in case you're new to Comics in Color, I got a list of things that I'm going to read off as I am contractually obligated because I'm supposed to say these things. Boston Comics in Color is New England's only comic arts festival focused on the stories by and about people of color. And this year, April 2025, will mark its 5th anniversary. It's a family-friendly event, and there's something for everyone. If you've already been down on the floor, you've probably seen that. Be sure to look for the live graffiti art and demos and meet comics creators from Boston and beyond at Artist Alley, where they sell books, artwork, and more. And you don't want to miss the cosplay contest that tops the off the day. Before I introduce the panel, I want to remind everybody to donate to the festival if you can. Your support keeps this event free and celebrates stories by people of color. Please use the hashtag BCICF 2024. And if you would like to silence your cell phones, which I will also do, then we'll get started.
Let me do that. And
so I'm going to turn this over to the other, you've already met Max. And I'm going to let the other panelists get started by introducing themselves. Tell us a little bit about your work, and then I'll start talking about comics and politics. And then we'll leave some time at the end, probably in about 40 minutes for you all to ask some questions. And if I talk too much, just stop.
No, that's
I'm a
fine.
professor, and no one has ever accused me of not being able to talk. So that's definitely a thing.
I'm a professor too, and he's trying to stop me from talking, but it's my job to talk a lot, and and I tell him to stop talking a lot.
Exactly.
Which I appreciate.
So let's start with you, Christopher O'Neill.
Yep. So I'm Christopher Rhodes. So I'm a lecturer also at Boston University in social sciences. I also lecture in government over at Harvard.
He teaches about history.
I do teach about history. I have a focus on issues of identity and politics, so race, gender, sexuality, religion, so on and so forth. I'm also the creator of this comic series 10. I like to call it a political science fiction book. And so it's basically the story of what would happen if we had superheroes in the real world. And so we have these people from around the world who, battle aliens and all those kind of things, but also, how would they impact real world issues? What would it be like being a black Superman, essentially, in the era of Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. And so that's the premise, and hopefully we do some really interesting and thought-provoking things with it.
Thank you.
I'm Raeghan Buchanan. I just really do comic books and zines about punk rock, like focusing on POC and Black people. I run an Insta gallery in October. That's a drawing challenge that has kind of like a month-long like prompts of Black punk bands and rock and roll bands to try to get people to participate in learning about kind of history that has kind of been hard to find because people have been kind of written out, or sometimes people just aren't interested in the ties of like rock and roll towards like Black punk rock and everything like that. So most of my work is kind of centered around that. I have a comic book downstairs out on Silver Sprocket called The Secret History of Black Punk, and it's the first that should be a series if I can get to drawing instead of traveling.
So I want to start off by an interesting question. Last night we had an event here for a lot of the people. Raeghan and I, our first time we met, and we were having this conversation. And Raeghan said something to the effect of, I don't know why I'm on this panel about comics and politics. I'm gonna Which, you know, because I'm old now and like I can't have a conversation in a place where there's a bar because I can't really talk. But it reminded me of something that a really good friend of mine said, which is everything's political. And so like I remember when she originally said this to me, I was like, everything's not political, right? But then I started thinking about it and like being people of color, or at least people outside of the dominant culture, having a conversation about who we choose to make the main character is a political statement, even though we're not necessarily, we might not be talking about like political issues. So I wonder, Raeghan, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, we were having that conversation yesterday.
I'll put you on blast, I'm
No,
sorry.
it's okay because I can talk about this. I feel as though, like I said yesterday, politics has a way of, or being political sometimes has a way of painting Black people or people of color in a certain light, and that's why people feel like they're allowed to treat people a certain way or erase certain things about people. And so with like my research about, you know, Black punk rock and things like that, it's been harder to, you know, find some things because people haven't been, you know, as diligent in recording. There's like flyers that people don't even show up on, or, you know, in magazines when they used to call out the shows, like some of the Black acts were not listed and things like that. And so they're just like given less importance. And you know, when somebody like me is going and looking for something like that, like it's just harder to find. And it is something that I would put more importance on if I was in those times. And I think, like, you know, politically, it was okay to do that. Like,
Right.
It's okay to, why would we care that? I've seen, you know, movies where I've seen like the Black punk rockers in the crowd, but like they didn't film the show. Like they filmed the white punk rockers because that's what people were interested about. And I also think that like portraying people in, you know, a sort of like more callous way is more common and things like that. And so when I try to look at the information that I can find, I try to be more careful about, I guess, like parsing that information, because they're only offering certain things. And like, I guess I'll give you like an example. There's a drummer from the band called The Controllers. It was an LA band. Her name was Mad Dog. And she was credited with kind of giving them a little bit more light because of her interview that she had with Slash Magazine. But in the interview, the interviewer is asking her certain questions that I would consider, like, punk rock is rude, so I understand that it's like, you know, whatever. But like, you know, asking her about gangs, asking her about gang life, asking her about Cadillacs, not asking her about like music or like shows and things like that. So like, I try to be like thoughtful about presenting that information to other people because you get to pick and choose what information that you present to other people. I do not want to play into like these like stereotypical questions and things like that. I want, even though I will be able to have it like less sensational and, you know, maybe less like exciting, oh, gangs or whatever. I want to let you know that, you know, Mad Dog, what I put in my book is like how she found this music and then like, you know, what her excitement for the music is and things like that. So I'm just trying to like show a picture in almost a more, I wouldn't say positive, but like something that brings tour for me. And if I have to like lose the sensational aspect of it, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, and I think, fun fact, I don't know if it's a fun fact. When I was in high school, I was in a hip hop group. And in Southwestern Virginia, where I was from, there weren't a lot of hip hop shows, so we played with a lot of punk bands.
Yeah.
So we would open for punk, like these like random like 90s hip hop with like Red 40 or Integration or like all of these random like punk bands. And it was weird. It's just like this weird thing. We would be in there, specifically Integration, the band. were very, like in 1990, were very anti-racist. They were like fighting racist skinheads. Like
Yes.
these guys were like, they were about it. They were like really about those things.
That's a phenomenon. I hear people ask about that, like, online, they'll say, did people really fight skinheads? But
Yes.
the racist skinheads.
Yeah.
But the racist skinheads used to come to shows because it's like, some of the music is like dumb.
Yeah.
And so, like, for example, my brother was in a band where they like fought like racist skinheads like from the stage
Yeah.
or whatever, because they would come to the shows and like kind of try
Yeah.
to take them over. So they did. Yeah, that was really
Yeah, they were about it. So let's switch a little bit. Christopher, your work is usually superhero based. And the last panel, we were last night when we were at the event, I was on a panel with Ben Passmore 2 years ago, and somebody asked us a question, and it was like, who's your favorite superhero? And Ben said, which like, I legitimately wrote this down, and it's like been echoing through my head for a long time. He's like, superheroes are just superpowered cops, and I don't like cops.
Okay.
And I was like, like bars, right? So, but also as an idea, and if any of you follow me online, when you hear me talk about Batman, I always talk about Batman as the worst superhero because he's basically Elon Musk. So with that being said, Chris, we're talking about like how you have conceived of a black superhero and how that works.
So,
Let Christopher ask.
Yes. And so, yes, and so, I think, it creates a whole lot of complications. When I was thinking about, creating a black superhero, creating a black kind of Superman figure, I started thinking about my uncles. I started thinking about my uncles who served in the military during the Vietnam. And, my uncle would tell a story, I fought for my country, I fought for my country, I came back, to my rural town in South Carolina, and I couldn't buy a soda from the local store still. And so when you have a character like this, this guy, peacekeeper Brian Johnson, he's a military man, he's a Navy vet who's now has been called on to serve in this new way, and he's fighting for America. And the big twist in the comic is he's fighting for America, but he's banned in America. He can't be a superhero in the United States itself. And
Like Eugene Bullard.
Right. So it's just like, you think about all these examples, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, you look at, okay, you're serving this country, you're enforcing this system that is rejecting you at the same time.
Right.
And there's a tension in that, and it kind of comes to a head. And, it's kind of called, do I obey the rules? Do I go along with the system because it's my duty, is what I've sworn to do or whatnot? At what point does that break? And what does that break look like?
Right.
How do you buck a system that's put you in a position of power in the first place and use that power to try to change that system? It's not easy, and that's kind of the complication.
Yeah.
Is that it's the first step, getting to that realization. It comes with time, it comes with experience. The second step is the hard one, and it's like, can we reform it? Can we reform it from within, or do we have to break up the whole thing down?
Right.
And there's not an easy answer to that. And what you see, I think, with these characters is wrestling with that. And so that's what I want to do.
Right.
I don't want to be, the guy to give the answers. I'd be, somewhere else if I handle the answers. But I want to ask the question. And I want to explore this in this exaggerated way, with lasers and flying and all these kind of things. Because I think it really, if there was a black man who could fly around and had superpowers, during an era of police brutality,
They would stop that immediately.
like, they wouldn't let you anywhere near.
Yeah, like that would definitely be like a holy moment.
It was like, yeah, we're going to send you to Siberia.
Yeah.
Something's happening over there. Like,
How do we
don't pay
stop
attention.
this immediately, right? I mean, that like just that exact example, right? And I'll tell you all about Eugene Bullard in a second, but like we actually had a situation in which we had black people who were basically using the Constitution and their constitutional right to protect, like in a vigilante sort of a way, right? And that was the Black Panthers. And what does Ronald Reagan do as soon as he hears about this, right? We get the first gun control laws in America,
California.
right? In California, because Black people are exercising their rights to protect themselves. And so I think that they're, you know, like, and I think you raise an interesting question about like, how do superheroes, or even just like because superheroes are like basically superpowered law enforcement, right? How do they uphold this system? And then, but how do they also struggle with it? Which is why I typically move away from superheroes who are fighting. Because I mean, if you go back to this idea, like I was talking about Batman, right? Batman, in every Batman movie, right? The first people he's fighting in every single movie are poor people, right? He's fighting some like street thug, right? You know, like somebody. Why do people commit crimes? They don't just commit crimes because, you know, they're sociopaths, right? They commit crimes because of lack of access and those things. And so Batman, who is a billionaire, can solve these problems, but he does not, right? He does not solve these problems. He builds a super suit to beat up poor people. And so, like, how do you deal with that sort of idea in your comics? And don't get me wrong, I'm not 100% opposed to superheroes, right? It's just more about like, how do you deal with the law and order aspect? Because I feel like some superheroes are the fruition of Nixon's law and order politics.
Oh, that's no doubt. Yeah, and I think the thing is, you know, it's not easy because, you know, if you just peel, not even very far beyond the surface, you get exactly that. There's a certain level of small c conservatism that's kind of inherent in superheroes.
Explain, in case people don't understand, explain the difference between small c and capital C conservatism.
Sure. So capital C conservatism is, you know, explicitly political, partisan. You know, you think of the Republican Party currently, all these kind of things. Small c conservatism, just in a more broader general sense, preserving the status quo, preserving the system that, by definition, has worked for the people in power. The people who have the power to maintain or change that system are the ones least inclined to do so, because it's clearly benefited them. And so, superheroes, in a sense, are doing that in, again, these extraordinary, exaggerated ways. You know, what is Bruce Wayne doing? Again, you know, he's, you know, catching these muggers. He's catching, you know, all these people who, you know, who don't even really get backstories. So, you know, we're just left to assume, oh, they must just be bad guys, not, you know, they've been driven by a system that creates the billionaires like him, on the one hand, at the expense of everyone else. And, you know, occasionally, you know, you'll get a writer, not in movies, maybe in the comics or whatnot, that will try to tackle those things. But inevitably, it goes back to the status quo. And so what I think, you know, and being an indie publisher, you know, you can do whatever you want to. You get the freedom to actually lean into that, to see, you know, if a hero, not just for a story, not just for an issue, but permanently decides to bug the system and becomes, you know, an enemy of the state in a sense, because of course they would be at that point. What happens? You know, what does the state, you know, put against them? How do they fight back? How far do they push that fight? You know, I think we've seen that trend in kind of the 90s and 2000s of telling you stories of superheroes essentially taking over. You'll have the superhero who will overthrow the government, who will, you know, enforce his or her own brand of justice. And there's a certain temptation in that, right, of looking at, okay, this is the ultimate kind of revolutionary fantasy. And of course, those stories usually end badly. They usually are kind of cautionary tales for why you shouldn't do that in the first place. But what if they don't? What if you actually lean into that? What if, you know, this more radical alternative is better than what we have? And what if, you know, in this fantasy, we have someone who individually has the power to implement that? You know, superheroes, you know, can stand for movements. They can stand for, you know, the types of things that we collectively do, embodied in this kind of symbolic character. And so that's, you know, one of the big places where this story is going. And I think some others too. If you look at kind of the indie scene, they have that space as well.
Yeah. Raeghan, your work is more nonfiction based. And so you're dealing with counterculture in a different way, and sort of, you know, fighting the narrative of what punk rock is in a lot of ways. Can you talk a little bit more about like how that features in your work?
Yeah, it's kind of just So so punk rock a lot of times is billed as a like great departure from rock and roll. If you look at the early punk bands or like the British punk bands and things like that, although they listened to rock and roll and they listened to like the proto-punk bands that like were kind of a bridge between, they kind of talk about it as a rejection of everything that came before it. And so some people are able to kind of sway that into punk rock being a white musical form. And if you erase that bridge and you connect it back to rock and roll, then it becomes very clear that this is a continuation of a Black musical form that, is like an American, mixture of jazz and blues and R&B and, things from the church and everything like that. And so in my comic, The Secret History of Black Punk, I try to introduce, it's not introducing, but I try to introduce the book with Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who is not always so well known because more people talk about Chuck Berry and more people talk about Elvis, but Sister Rosetta Tharpe is somebody that they listened to and learned from and cited, and she gets lost a lot. And it's not because the musicians didn't cite her. It's because people were musicians like Elvis had like more money behind them. White people at the time were more interested in Elvis than, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And so his story is kept alive, while hers has kind of been reintroduced, but sort of hasn't always been there. And so I try to, in my comic, I try to introduce, well, not introduce, I keep saying introduce, but I don't mean introduce. I'm not the first person who's done any of this stuff, but I try to kind of be a link for people to learn about her and kind of know a little bit about why, that she's in this lineage. Did I answer that?
Yeah. I want to ask you too, because you and Christopher both have are very Christopher does independent and you're publishing with a small press, but I'm sure you published many comics first, which is and zines, which is a very I feel like a lot of cartoonists that I know, specifically who were working in the 90s, really actually Nate Powell grew out of making zines for punk bands, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people did this kind of thing. Can you talk about that connection to that DIY? Well, let me ask a different question first. I want to get back to the question of the counterculture thing, and how personally I think without Black people there is no American culture, right? There's nothing, right? Black people are only 13% of the population, but how much of the culture do we dictate, right? How many people have heard somebody in a boardroom say bling, right? Or this, even our bodies get commodified, right? And so can you talk about can you talk a little bit more about the link from, because all music, I think all American music comes from Black music.
Yes.
And talk a little bit more about how the erasure of the, when I was a kid, even when I was doing those shows with those bands, I was that's for the white kids that are coming, right? I was always thinking about that. And then there was a small subset of kids that would come to see us play. Very small. I wasn't, let me just be real clear, we weren't big time. So very small. It was 15 people. Can you talk a little bit more about the connection to punk rock and how it's not specifically white people's music?
Well, so again, I think it's the connection to rock and roll that can show you where punk rock came from. But a lot of times when my friends will talk about it, they'll talk about how Black people were the first DIY, because even way back in the day you had to create like different ways of like talking to each other. You were talking about like how if there was a black superpower, like a black man who could fly, then there would be a law against that. Like the black codes
Yeah.
that happened right before, they were like basically they just kept adding to them
Yeah.
based on what they saw people do.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times people are like, oh, enslaved people were not allowed to read. Well, they were at first until Nat Turner. And then, things like, then it was like, that part was deleted
Yeah.
or whatever. And then people were, have you ever heard the talking drums? Or, you know what I mean? Where you get, well, anyways, people use drums to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And so then people were not allowed to use or play music
Yeah.
or whatever. So those laws were just basically like, what are you doing now? All right, you're not allowed to do that.
Right.
Or whatever. But so people had to keep doing different ways of like DIY back in the day just to keep going and just to survive. Like a lot of times people talk about how the different religions were preserved by like grafting them onto Christianity because they were allowed to do Christianity but not to practice their own religion and things like that. There were things called the ring shouts where people would take, it's like a culture that, came from a mixture of different places, but they had like the circle, and they had like a lot of music that like, I mean, you can hear in like, the people who preserved the music from the ring shouts, you can hear like garage rock in it, and you can hear hardcore in it, and you can like, people weren't allowed to use drums, so they kept the beat in different ways. And like they, what's that thing called? The
Washboard?
Yeah, the handbook thing or whatever. And like different things that people kept creating
Yeah.
in order to sort of like, preserve culture, but also move forward. Like Black people are, usually the people that are moving music forward. And sometimes things become, like I used the example of like, I don't know, the Lindy Hop, where a lot of people white people perform like Lindy Hop and like troops right now. And so you don't see as many, you don't see the beginnings of that being like Black culture.
Yeah.
Because white people are kind of preserving that. I'm not saying that Black people aren't, but
Yeah.
like Black people have like, always like kind of like moving on and like mixing things and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And even in my book, like I talk about like, I love talking about the history of Black punk rock and trying to find and add things in where I didn't find it before. But like in the beginning of my book, I'm kind of like, for real, like Black people are not as interested in falling into this like rigid kind of like punk rock, setting or like genre
Yeah.
or whatever. We're more interested in like expanding and like, adding different things to it.
I feel like the nature, tell me if I'm wrong about this, because like the people that I know that are super into punk, like they resist being put in any kind of box whatsoever. Even like
Even
say
the
like
first
you're-
punk rockers
yeah.
didn't want to be called punk rock.
Yeah.
And like, a lot of people don't even like that
Yeah.
name
Yeah.
or whatever. And even, so I know everybody's like, heard of like, like Bad Brains.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, or I consider them the first like hardcore band. And a lot of people do, but even that term was like a term that was like it's not hardcore meant something else before it meant like hardcore punk. And so they don't like necessarily,
Something in that.
yeah, I don't
I'm just doing these quotes.
But
Y'all
the-
can fill in the blank.
The same thing with the word punk. That
Yeah,
is a
right.
slang term.
Right.
So like not everybody wants to be called a punk
Yeah.
or whatever. So yeah, people are not always I interrupted you.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
People are not always wanting to be called that. And a lot of people, just a lot of people in general, don't always say it in punk and hardcore because there's limitations after you get good.
Right. It feels like, like I just think that, it's almost like punk is such a counterculture music that it really tries to defy any box. It's almost like puppies, right? If you get a puppy, a brand new puppy, right? Like they're now running around. Every time you try to put them in a cage, in a box, and anything, they're always trying to break out, right? They're never going to like sit in that cage. But as soon as they're no longer puppies, that's when they're in the cage, but they're not puppies anymore, right? And so punk is kind of like that, right?
It's so many things. It's really hard to talk about, and I feel like I've picked like one of these things that like I can say anything and anybody could disagree because it's like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it was so many different things at the same time. So I've said this, and definitely people have disagreed with me, and people who were there earlier than me have disagreed with me. But I feel like in some senses, punk was almost like a neighborhood, like, pockets of neighborhoods, like phenomenon that ended up getting really big eventually. And so sometimes people argue about like, or recategorize even genres. Like if you've heard people talk about like, for example, Blondie, they're like, oh, they were disco or whatever. But all of these punk bands in the beginning sounded very different from each other and were like very much categorized by like location and, being rough around the edges and like playing residencies and stuff like that at the same bars and dressing kind of in a certain way.
The people that would go, like, how weird that people would go to like uptown or downtown, they would go to a punk show and then they go uptown to a hip hop show. Like there was same people like moving, and then like Blondie, who was supposed to be punk, was also like a rapper.
I think she had the first like
Rapture
video
where
in
Basquiat plays Fab Five Freddy. So Fab Five Freddy, when she talks to him, it's actually Basquiat. It's not Fab Five Freddy.
She's like, which is funny because like she knows that's not.
Wow.
But in hip hop,
Hip hop
grew up in the same.
Close,
and there was like people who hung out with it, like the people from Blondie, they would hang out with Fab Five Freddy.
Yeah.
And they would like, the Clash Notorious. I'm not gonna remember who right now, but the Clash definitely brought a lot of hip hop acts on tour.
Yeah.
They were abused. Like people were like, get them off the stage or whatever sometimes. But they did try. A lot of people think like that's a different.
I feel like hip hop and punk are kind of like siblings that don't talk to each other.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
They
do. Sometimes they meet at a family reunion.
No,
where you been?
There are like several, like Dee Dee Ramone has like a rap record. It's like horrible. It is terrible. It's got a song called like Mashed Potato Time. It's like.
Wait a minute, is Dee Dee the bad one?
Dee Dee, no, that's Johnny.
Okay. Like, there's one of the Ramones is like a bad one, right?
Yeah, Johnny is the conservative one.
Okay, Johnny's the conservative, yeah.
But, and then Wendy O. Williams also has a terrible rap record from the Plasmatic. They're like, terrible.
So.
I'm sorry.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to, but thank you for that. I want to switch gears a little bit. Christopher, why comics for this story?
Yeah, because I think comics are really important for this because they're unlimited in their storytelling potential. You don't have to have a studio backing, you don't have to have a budget, you don't have to have special effects, all these kind of things. And you can tell these stories. You can tell these stories through spectacle. And especially because, a lot of, in the mainstream at least, we associate comics with superheroes. Like comics obviously are so many more than that. But, even leaning into the superhero genre, you can use that to tell stories in a way where if you just want to read it on this level as an action story, you can do that. There'll be people doing that. And then the second or third time you're reading it, it's like, wait a minute, this says something else. And it's making things that we've deemed, unpalatable, palatable. Through a popular genre and through a popular narrative.
Right.
And again, as I say, especially when you're, doing a small press or you're doing independent, there's no one looking over your shoulder. There's no one telling you can't do this. And it really is, in a lot of ways, kind of one of, if not the most kind of democratic storytelling techniques that we still have.
Yeah.
You know, you can write this, you can put that out there, you know, you have social media, we have all these kind of things, and find your audience and get your message across. Maybe you'll make some money, maybe you'll not. But you get to say what you want to say, and you get to say what you want to say in a way where sky's the limit, where you can use all the tropes of science fiction, of fantasy, of whatnot, to shape a world in a way that serves as metaphor, that serves as allegory. You know, X-Men have a big, you know, kind of renaissance at the moment.
Oh, yeah,
And-
X-Men 97.
Exactly.
Go watch it.
Oh, yes.
So great. So-
Yeah. And, you know, the original X-Men animated show, you know, the
Was
first version
great,
was
yeah.
great. That's what got me into comics.
Yeah.
You know, when I was a kid, now I'm very much older than him. And, you know, the metaphor of racism and of discrimination and whatnot, people understand it when it's mutants, when it's people with power.
And which is funny
in a
about
way that
that,
they want, because
what's-
it's not,
Yeah, what's funny about that is that that metaphor that you're talking about, like, has been applied to it, right?
Right.
Because it wasn't their idea. They were just
Exactly.
like, we're gonna, like, this is kind of happening out in the world, but I'm gonna ask this question again, because I think this is an important question, but I'll follow up with that. But I think that's an important thing, like, you know, like, I was gonna ask you specifically how you got into comics, and I'm gonna come back and ask you the same questions, right? So you can prepare your
I'll
response.
prepare.
Yeah. So like, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just got excited about that. But how did you get into why? So like, you talked a little bit about why comics are important, but why are they important to you, and how did you get there? How did you get there?
They're important to us because they're important to us because they have character and stuff, and in my comics I put a lot of work into there, and they're important to us because the setting on comics is good.
yes, it is.
And that is what we have to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so, yes.
And how did you get it? How did you get into it?
I already talked about it.
I know. I'm just going to elaborate. I'm going to just elaborate a little bit on what you said. And so, yeah, I think that it's really important when you have, again, you know, these fantasy settings where, again, you know, I was a big X-Men fan. I watched Batman and these other kind of
Yeah.
things, and they were really good storytelling and everything. But X-Men is the one that really resonated.
Yeah.
And at first, you know, it's because of, you know, the spectacle, the soap opera, the fantastic powers and
Yeah.
everything. But I think the thing is, and you're absolutely correct, it didn't start out as a metaphor.
No, we didn't.
But the logic of the story itself kind of leaned into that in ways that even the creators didn't initially intend, and people kind of adopted it, and you know, and now you have a new generation of writers who've grown up looking at it through those lenses, and are now just, you know, it's far from perfect because big corporation and everything, but in terms of actual representation, you know, one of the things that have been a big debate in that comic is you're using this as, say, a metaphor for racism,
Yeah.
but all the characters are white men.
Yeah.
And so I think what that's inspired me to do is to go that step farther,
Yeah.
and be like, you know, create a comic where the premise is diverse, where, you know, it's people from around the world, you know, by design,
Right.
so that we're not, you know, telling the story of oppressed minorities through the lens of a white man.
Right.
But we're actually putting it up, you know, as we were saying at the beginning of this, you know, the first level of politics is representation.
Right.
When we start to see faces that look like ours, you know, people that act like us, people that sound like us, we are here, we're visible, we exist.
Right.
And we can be powerful in all these different ways.
So I'm going to elaborate on that, and then I'm going to go to you, Ricky. But I think what's interesting about the fact that X-Men has been seen as a metaphor for racism and the civil rights struggle. What I personally believe is that this is why I think comics are important, is that the zeitgeist is what we need to put out into the world, how we need to get this information out into the world. So at every juncture in American history, when there has been something permeating in culture, like popular culture resonates with it, and then we see that, right? So in 2016, after the election of 2016, we got a bunch of horror movies about holding still and being quiet, right? In the 1970s, at the end of the civil rights movement, we get the X-Men. In the 1960s, we get all of the actual turmoil of the 1960s, and we got Planet of the Apes. And when Jack Johnson beats, what's his name, Dempsey, for a heavyweight champion of the world, one of the biggest blockbuster movies was King Kong, right? About white people going into the jungle and capturing these things. So what happens is black culture, or not so much black culture, but the zeitgeist is what runs things, right? In the late 90s and all through the early 2000s, we had a bunch of disaster movies where the president was black, right? 2008, we get a black president. We had, gay people on television, one of the most popular TV shows, Ellen and Will and Grace, right? And then we get the Dobbs decision. So you get all of these things that, when they get out to the zeitgeist, actually, that, I don't believe policy changes mind. I think it's actually pop culture that actually changes people's mind. So, back to you. That's my
That should be a panel. I'm very, very interested in, I've never really thought about it like that, like with the movies.
It really is. You can see it. Like, there were like 5 movies in 2016 about holding still and being quiet. And if you just hold still and be quiet, everything's going to be okay.
Wow.
Right?
Oh.
And like, that was the reaction, right? You get these things that actually permeate throughout culture. So talk about why comics was the medium for you, and then we'll take 10 minutes and you guys can ask some questions.
I think it's what we've kind of been talking about with the DIY. Like, so I started getting into comic books when I was very young, like 10 or 11. And it was my brothers, they listened to, punk rock and roll, and rap, and I was like always at their door, like, what y'all doing in there? What you doing in there? And stealing their comics and stuff like that. The first comic book that I read that I started collecting comic books was Spawn 10.
You got to read Maple Terrace.
Maple-
Remind me to tell you about this book.
Okay.
It's a really great book.
So, and Spawn was he's made out of, necroplasm. That's not what it is.
He's the devil.
Okay. I say it wrong sometimes,
Yeah.
so I can't remember if I'm like, it's like protoplasm, it's necroplasm. But he was a black, anti-hero.
Yeah.
So this is like, the first comic book that I picked up. There was a comic book shop about 5 blocks away from my house. And I started reading comics like right when they put out like a run of the Sandman where they started from #1 in like sequential like order and stuff like that. And I was reading things like, Preacher, Garth Ennis stuff.
Preacher's amazing.
Deathblow, I was going through my brother's like comics, and he had a lot of like, Rob Liefeld stuff and different things like that. But I wasn't so interested in that. What I was getting out of the Sandman was this like, kind of fabled storytelling. Like we grew up with Anderson and Grimm tales and scary stories to tell in the dark, and like these morality type things and stuff like that. And so I think I was less drawn to superhero comics, which might have something to do with representation, and more drawn to kind of like stories that I thought were like dark and like, kind of like where you had to, like, I was a very moody kid. So
It was funny when you say Spawn, because when John and I had dinner with my wife came down, and because we've been married 29 years, before we were people, we got married. One of the things that I would do is I would go to the comic book store and I would bring back comics, and it was Spawn, and I'm like, let me read you this amazing comic. And she's like, okay, because she liked me. And then when I tell the story now, it's kind of like, I tolerated it. I tolerated you reading Spawn.
No. So, and Todd McFarlane, he's a white guy, obviously. But like, I just like those stories, some of the stories, like the one story where where they give him the decision to either remain like Spawn or be a blue-eyed, blonde-haired white guy, and he's just like, no. So like stuff like that, was like really funny.
It was very radical at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really great. So we've got 10 minutes left. Do you all have any questions? And if you ask me a question, that's going to be your 10 minutes. I'm just going to
Anybody have questions?
I have a question for Chris. Do you find any overlap with your history teaching and the people you encounter with the comics?
Oh, yeah, so really good question. So yes, absolutely. And so without spoiling too much, one of the big kind of metaphors built into this comic in the long run is imperialism and colonialism. This is something I teach about a lot. He helps me teach about it a lot. And this is one of those things where it's like, we have these benevolent aliens who come and give powers to all these people.
Yeah.
Why would someone do that?
And
What is their
also-
underlying motivation?
And also, I'm the one who makes the people.
Yes.
So in 10-3, there's gonna be Metal on the road.
Yes. Always make sure you get credit for your work. And so when we are telling these stories, it's what is the underlying motivation? And when we think about that historically, it's kind of the white savior complex. It's like, we're this superior position. We're going to come, and give our culture, our power, our knowledge to these people. And it's always self-serving. It's always a cover to some degree for what are our interests. And so that's one example of the way in kind of which, through metaphor, we get to talk about, an actual kind of historical process that in some ways is still ongoing in a lot of ways.
I was actually thinking more in terms of the people that you interact with.
Oh, I see. In terms of people I interact with, that's a really good question. I mean, I occasionally kind of bring this into the classroom with my students. It's like, they're like, oh, Professor Rhodes, so where can we buy your comic? And I'm like, graduate first, and then come back and find me. But yeah, and once or twice, I've incorporated comics into the teaching as well. Not my own stuff, but some of the classic stuff. Iron Man from the Vietnam War, or Captain America in World War II, or things like that. So that's kind of the overlap that I've tended to find so far.
Yes.
For Chris, do you think that, like, in your story, the existence of aliens does affect, like, race and other things and how that's seen? Like, knowing that there is another, like, group of life out there, does that affect how race is seen in America? Do you think that?
Yeah, again, it's a super good question. I think in the short run it would. And so, we think about these movies, Independence Day, for example, where the idea is if the aliens show up, we band together as humanity, we forget all of our differences and so on and so forth for this common cause. The last 400 years of history and the last 4 years of history have made me think that that's not actually what would happen. But
Except our alien overlords.
And I think historically, if you look at these, what can be these pivotal moments, what actually happens, we have an amazing ability as humans to readjust to new information in ways that confirms the things we already believed in the first place. One of the things I kind of teach about in my class, one of my classes teach about ancient China. China, before Europeans showed up, had their own kind of proto kind of racial hierarchy, right? Like you're either Chinese or you're barbarians. You're people who are outside. And then Europeans show up with their ideas of, wait, we're the superior race, and start teaching and disseminating this idea. And so what Chinese intellectuals start doing is they take that European idea of race and put themselves back at top. It's like, now, you guys almost got it right.
Uno reverse.
And so it's a little bit cynical, but I also think it's real, right? It's like, it takes a lot to overcome those things. And so even aliens showing up, I think, by itself wouldn't be enough in the long run.
Yeah, because I read Watchmen and I'm like, Alan Moore is not right about, like, sending in a fake alien, the whole world just reuniting afterward. That's not happening.
Exactly, right. Like, maybe that gives you a year, and then everybody's back to fighting again. It's
I think
like,
the Watchmen show in 2018 kind of fixed that, like, thought that Ozymandias has in that book, but
Yeah.
regardless.
yes. Again, which is what happens when you bring black creatives and creators from other
Yeah.
backgrounds into these properties.
Any other questions?
I guess I have a question.
Okay.
It's not really a question. I don't even know if it's appropriate for this setting.
Yes, it is.
Well, real quick, I go to school here, RCC, and
Yeah.
I'm actually working on a transfer to Mass Art. You guys are probably.
I used to teach at Mass Art.
All right, cool. So I go to school for visual arts and stuff like that. I just happened to see this banner out there. That's why I came. So I don't even know what this is about, right? But it's actually really cool. Is this like a kind of like a group? This whole comic?
Comics in Color?
Yeah.
So it's part of the Boston Comics Art Foundation funds a lot of comic conventions around Boston. KidsCon, Comic-Con, MICE.
Yeah.
And it's just part of those things to create more community engagement with comics in the world.
It is awesome. I love what you guys are doing. I would love to be a part of it. Quick question too, right? Just off of my head. Like speaking of Basquiat and stuff, you know how he blew up because I feel like he represented the struggle, the black struggle, right?
Yeah.
And like when it comes to like cultures, like back in the 90s, like it was like the Wu-Tang stuff, the Wu-Tang movies and stuff like that. And do you think this movement will have a big exposure like that?
Oh, I mean, it's so a couple of things. I think Basquiat would argue against the idea that he blew up specifically because he was representing black culture.
He kind of blew up
He
like a
blew
little
up-
bit in like that bubble of like where they were kind of creating that vacuum for
Yeah.
expensive art. Or
Yeah,
art
and
as
so-
well.
Like they said that
Well, he actually, and he also fought against the idea of like, I think Basquiat was in a lot of ways the product of exoticism, right? Like, people would like tell these stories about Basquiat, like he's this untrained, primitive, and he doesn't know anything, like he's just coming out of the wilds. And it's like, no, like he was hanging out with art kids in New York, right? At SVA, and like he was drawing out of Grey's Anatomy. And then they would say these like, he's the greatest black artist who's ever run. Like Romare Bearden doesn't exist. Jacob Lawrence doesn't, Aaron Douglas doesn't exist. Like it was almost as if like, and then in a lot of ways, I've got my MFA in painting, even though I make comics now. A lot of times people have this tendency to think about Basquiat as like this avant-garde type of artist at his time, and he was. Don't get me wrong, he really was. But a lot of the hype around Basquiat was related to his blackness, which he actually fought against. Right? Like there's a really famous interview where they asked him, "What's it like to be a black artist?" And he goes, "What's it like to be a white reporter?" Right? Because he really fought against those ideas. And so
He did that Toni Morrison response.
yeah. Yeah, he was Basquiat was and he was very much he was very counterculture in his way, but the art scene as it has been since the 1980s is very capitalistic in nature.
That's how I feel like that's kind of what like destroyed him.
Yeah,
Or,
it
like,
did,
that's
absolutely.
how he, came to whatever spiral down.
Yeah, absolutely. That
Because
was,
of just the whirlwind around like trying to stay on top in this like kind of falsely constructed like bubble.
I mean, if you look at Basquiat's later work, it was clear that Basquiat was making work so that he could buy drugs. And it wasn't until he actually started when he actually started doing those collaborations with Andy Warhol, where it felt like he was doing some things that were really interesting again. But with that said, that's going to be the conclusion of our panel. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you guys for answering the questions. I hope I didn't talk for you.
No.